Hello everyone. Oh, why does it do that? Hello everyone. My name is Ashley Madelon. I'm a P4 student at the University of Charleston in West Virginia. My preceptor is Dr. Andrew, and I'm going to be presenting to you about expedited programs and marketed unapproved drugs. We're going to start off by conducting an overview of different expedited programs. Following that, we will discuss indications for which these programs are commonly used. Then we will review current events involving these programs. Next, we will discuss unapproved drugs, and then we'll have a brief overview of pharmacy student exposure to these programs, as well as the clinical study process. Okay. So expedited programs are given different designations based on their intent. Their purpose is to expedite patients' access to important treatments for serious conditions. There are 4 different types of designations. There's fast track, breakthrough therapy, accelerated approval, and priority review. We're going to go over a couple definitions that we will come across during this presentation. So a serious or life-threatening condition is a disease or condition associated with morbidity that has a substantial impact on day-to-day functioning. The drug intended to treat serious conditions, it must be intended to have an effect on a serious condition or serious aspect of a condition, such as having a direct effect on serious manifestations or symptoms of a condition or other intended effects, such as the ones listed below. An unmet medical need is a condition whose treatment or diagnosis not addressed adequately by available therapy. A substantial improvement is a matter of judgment, and it depends on both the magnitude of the drug's effect on a clinically significant endpoint and the importance of observed effect to the treatment of a condition. A clinically significant endpoint is an endpoint that measures an effect on irreversible morbidity or mortality, which you might see as IMM from now on, or on symptoms that represent serious consequences of the disease. A clinical endpoint is a characteristic or variable that directly measures therapeutic effect of a drug. And lastly, a clinical benefit is a positive therapeutic effect that is clinically meaningful in the context of the given disease. A preliminary clinical evidence is just evidence that is sufficient to indicate that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement in effectiveness or safety over available therapies. In substantial improvement, the determination of whether the improvement over available therapy is substantial is a matter of judgment, and it depends on both the magnitude of the drug's effect on a clinically significant endpoint and the importance of the observed effect to the treatment of the serious condition or serious aspect of the condition. Okay, first we have fast track designation, which is applied to a drug if it is intended, whether alone or in combo with one or more drugs, for the treatment of a serious or life-threatening disease or condition, and it demonstrates the potential to address unmet medical needs for such a disease or condition. Information that can support this designation is theoretical rationale, mechanistic rationale based on non-clinical data, and evidence of non-clinical activity. Actions taken to expedite development and review of a drug could be meetings between the sponsor and the FDA, whether it be before the sponsor submits the investigational new drug application or at the end of phase 1 and 2 trials. And the purpose of these meetings would be to discuss study design, the extent of the safety data needed to support fast track approval, or dose response concerns or biomarker use. So the sponsor can submit or request this designation at any time between the time they submit their IND and before they submit their biologic licensing application or new drug application for approval. But ideally, they should submit their request no later than a pre-BLA or pre-NDA, and the FDA has 60 days to respond. Some products granted fast track may not continue to meet the criteria for the designation, and reasons for that may be that the drug no longer demonstrates the potential to address an unmet medical need, or the drug, may not be being studied in a manner that shows the drug product can treat the serious condition and meet that unmet medical need. So for breakthrough therapy, this designation is applied to a drug if the drug is intended alone or in combo with one or more drugs to treat serious life-threatening disease, and preliminary clinical evidence indicated that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over existing therapies. So information that could support this designation is definitely the preliminary clinical evidence showing that there's a substantial improvement over available therapies on one or more clinically significant endpoints. You could also do a single arm study comparing this new treatment with the available therapy and and showing like the differences or the similarities. Actions taken to expedite review would be to the product could be eligible for a priority review if it's supported by clinical data at the time of BLA, NDA, or efficacy supplement submission. I'm going to delete that part. That part's kind of redundant, so sorry about that. Sponsors may request designation anytime after initial IND submissions, but they should not send the request until they have that preliminary clinical evidence. That part is key. And then the FDA must respond within 60 days. Okay, accelerated approval. This pathway is applied to a drug if it has an effect on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, or on a clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than IMM, or is reasonably likely to predict an effect on IMM or other clinical benefit, taking into account the severity, rarity, or prevalence of the condition and the availability of lack of alternative treatments. Conditions to being granted this pathway is promotional materials must be approved by the FDA within 120 days following marketed approval. So any and every promotional material must be submitted and approved by the FDA. They also, or sponsors and applicants must also perform confirmatory trials after the drug has been on the market. There is no specific timeline on when these studies need to be done, but the protocol for these trials should be developed as early as possible, and timelines for the trial should be specified between the sponsor and the FDA. The FDA may withdraw approval of this drug or indication, and reasons that might happen is, the trial, the confirmatory trial that is used to verify the clinical benefit actually shows that the product fails to verify such benefit. Another reason would be that there's evidence to demonstrate that the product is not shown to be safe or effective under this indication. The applicant may fail to conduct the trials at all, or they may disseminate false or misleading promotional materials. But if the approval is withdrawn, the applicant has the opportunity for a hearing, and they must respond within 15 days, letting the FDA know that they do want a hearing. Otherwise, they waive their opportunity. Okay, so again, the purpose of the accelerated approval program is to get drugs that show promising evidence of clinical benefit out onto the market sooner for patient use. So some drugs granted this approval are out on the market an extended period without these post-clinical trials being done to prove that they do have clinical benefit. So the Energy and Commerce Committee Chairman, Frank Pallone, is introducing the Accelerated Approval Integrity Act, which is meant to give the FDA the authority they need to ensure clinical benefit is proven for these drugs. So pretty much to make sure that these post-marketing trials are being done, and also streamlining the process for the FDA to take the ineffective products off the market. Lastly, we have priority review designation, and this designation is applied to drugs if the drug treats a serious condition and if approved would provide significant improvement in safety or effectiveness. So its intent is to direct overall attention and resources to the evaluation of such applications. The sponsor may submit the request for designation when they submit an original BLA, NDA, or efficacy supplement, and the FDA must respond within 60 days if they are granting priority review designation, or within 74 days if they are not permitting that designation. Some common indications for these designations would be HIV, neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder, which is through fast track. Cancer is a big indication. You can see I've got multiple types of cancers listed, and they are going through different designations right now. We also have Alzheimer's disease. There's a current drug out right now that's going through the accelerated approval process. And then this link that I have here shows you any and every drug that is going through these designations as of January of 2021, if you were curious. Okay, second half of the PowerPoint is about unapproved drugs. Unapproved drugs are drugs that have not been reviewed by the FDA for safety, effectiveness, or quality. Using these drugs have resulted in patient harm or can pose significant risk to these patients because there's no way to know, one, if they're safe and effective, or if these drugs have been manufactured correctly to ensure consistent quality. And also, we don't know if their label is complete and accurate. So if FDA approval is required by law, how are these drugs on the market? And it's because the FDA can permit some unapproved drugs to be marketed if they go through the DESI program, which I will talk about a little bit later. It stands for the Drug Efficacy Study Implementation, and it's a program that was implemented earlier on. These drugs can be on the market if healthcare professionals rely on the drug to treat serious medical conditions, and also maybe if there's an insufficient supply of an approved drug, then the unapproved drugs can be used in their place. Okay, so just a quick history update, or a quick history overview of these unapproved drugs. In 1906, the Federal Food and Drug Act prohibited the sale of adulterated or misbranded drugs that did not require FDA approval. From 1938 to 1962, drugs were approved based on safety alone, but not efficacy. Next, in 1962, the FDCA was amended, and this is where the DESI program came into play. And this program evaluated the effectiveness of these drugs that were approved between 38 and 62. So the FDA and the National Academy of Science and the National Research Council evaluated 3,400 drugs, and the findings were published in the Federal Register. The DESI program also covered identical, related, or similar drugs, similar to the drugs that were approved between 38 and 62. So that's like another 3,400 drugs that went through the DESI program. And so these DESI drugs were either classified as effective or were required to leave the market. So if they were approved by the DESI program, these drugs still have to go through new drug applications or abbreviated new drug applications. Otherwise, they would be forced to be removed from the market also. Excuse me. So there are a couple loopholes to the DESI program. Some products claimed to be marketed before 1938, which would protect them, which they would be protected under the 1938 grandfather clause. Sorry, hold on. Or there are drugs that are identical, related, or similar to drugs that were created before 1938, which also protects them under this grandfather clause. So this 1938 grandfather clause is if a drug was marketed prior to the passage of the 1938 Act, and which contained in its labeling the same representations concerning the conditions of use as it did before the passage of the Act, they were not considered a new drug, and therefore was exempt from the requirement of having an approved new drug application. But then there was this E-Ferrol tragedy of 1983, which led to the prescription drug wrap-up program. So E-Ferrol was an IV vitamin E injection that was identical, related, or similar to a pre-1962 drug. So it did not get evaluated by the DESI program. This drug caused severe adverse effects in 100 premature infants, and unfortunately 40 of them died. So this moved CDER to revise and expand this policy guidance to cover all marketed unapproved drugs instead of just DESI drugs only. So this Prescription Drug Act, or drug wrap-up program, involved evaluating the safety and efficacy of drugs that entered the market before 1938. And it was considered illegal to market these drugs unless the manufacturer could prove that they were protected under that grandfather clause. OTC drugs were originally included in the DESI program, but we all know how many different over-the-counter products there are now. And the FDA decided that including the over-the-counter drugs was an inefficient use of resources. So here is an example of how an unapproved drug can pose risks to patients and how their labels can be inaccurate or incomplete. This is about a study that was published in the Journal of Neurology Clinical Practice in 2020. Um, they used two supplement databases to find 10 different over the counter cognitive enhancement supplements. And these supplements contained onboracetam, aniracetam, phenylpiracetam, and oxiracetam, all of which are not approved in the US. So you can buy these and get them shipped to your house in the US. So these 10 supplements were bought and then they were analyzed using mass spectrometry. And several of these products had drugs that were detected but were not declared on their label, and vice versa. There were drugs that were detected, there were drugs that were on the label that were not detected. These extra drugs that were detected include phenibut, vinpocetine, and picamelon. So phenibut is a CNS suppressant and a neuropsychotropic. Vinpocetine can increase blood flow to the brain and protect neurons, or that's what resources say. And picamelon is a combo of niacin and GABA and can act as an anxiolytic. So these were drugs that were not on the drug label at all. The doses were also off. They found that consumers could be exposed to maximum pharmaceutical level doses of these drugs by taking just the recommended serving size. So there was 40 milligrams of onboracetam in one serving size when the typical dose is 10 milligrams. There was 502 milligrams of aniracetam in one of these products, and while the typical dose is between 200 and 750 milligrams. So all in all, 75% of the ingredients that were declared on the label had inaccurate amounts within one serving size. So this is just a huge example of how wrong the label can be for unapproved products, as well as you don't really know what you're getting. Some of these products didn't have the drug in it when it was on the label, or there were drugs that were in it that were not on the label, which can be kind of scary. As for over-the-counter drugs, in 1972, the agency began a process of reviewing these drugs via rulemaking by therapeutic class. So, advisory committee reviews data relating to claims and active ingredients and publishes their report to the Federal Register. So, this report is then reviewed by the FDA, and final monographs are published for each class. These monographs show sponsors the allowable claims they can make, the labeling, and the active ingredients for the OTC drugs in that class. Drugs that follow these monographs are considered generally recognized as safe and effective. And final and tentatively final monographs are in place for essentially every over-the-counter drug class today. One thing I did learn about while going through this is that some of the over-the-counter drugs aren't under these monographs. They actually have their own new drug applications. So some commonly used unapproved drugs. In 1984, there were more than 950 products that did not fall under the DESI program, nor were they under the grandfather exemption. So products like these included prescription biologics, oral vitamins, and medical diagnostic products. There are drugs that we still use today very commonly, such as phenobarbital, epinephrine, and colchicine. I did not know that colchicine was unapproved for years, but in 2009 it was approved for specifically familial Mediterranean fever and acute gout. So this is just an opinion of my own, not of the agency. Um, drugs that are generally recognized as safe and as effective may not need to be put through FDA approval. This is because manufacturers can be given market exclusivity as like a form of incentivizing that manufacturer for paying for the safety and efficacy trials. And doing that and giving exclusivity will drive up the price of that drug. And, it can cause drug shortages as well as make drugs unavailable to certain patients who can't afford it. An example of this is colchicine, like we just talked about. There was a study that reviewed Medicaid and Medicare claims from 2008 to 2017 that following the price per pill of colchicine. While adjusting for inflation and rebates, Medicaid's price in 2008, when unapproved formulations were on the market, was 24 cents a pill. In 2011, it was $4.20 per pill when Colchris was the only drug on the market. And then that price peaked at $4.66 per pill in 2015. So this is just an example of how drug availability can be diminished, as well as the affordability, just because a manufacturer went through the safety and efficacy trials and was given market exclusivity for that. Another example would be epinephrine. This life-saving drug costs hundreds of dollars due to manufacturer exclusivity. Some people have even been forced to outsource. I found an article about this new device called an APPE pencil, and it was created by what they like to call themselves as pharma hackers, and they made a product similar to an EpiPen for about $30 and are selling it to people. And this is an example of, again, making drugs unavailable to people due to, the price, but also it puts people in danger also because they're buying these products that have not gone through testing, so they may not work, and thus they're risking their lives because they can't afford the real drug. Excuse me. So for, at least in my opinion, drugs that have been around for a very long time and are generally recognized as safe as effective, I feel like at least in some cases, these safety and efficacy trials don't need to be done because we've been using them for a really long time. And I feel like you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of doing so. So if you do the trials, sometimes people can't afford their medications after that. So I don't know. It's just my opinion. Okay, as a pharmacy student, we're exposed to, we have law classes, of course, and we're exposed to the legal system and federal and state regulations of practice, and also the development and production and dispensing of medications and how to manage risk. And we go over very generally the process of clinical trials and how long it takes to go from trials to having a drug on the market. It's very brief, and things that we're not exposed to is different career opportunities within the FDA and industry. We, at least at my school, we were told pretty much like you could either go into retail or you can do a residency at a hospital. Like that we knew that we could work with the FDA, but we didn't know any of the different types of job descriptions or anything like that. So I've learned a lot while I've been here about different opportunities within the FDA. Um, we also were not exposed to any of the details about the clinical trial process, like INDs or NDAs. Um, did not know anything about expedited programs or, FDA sponsored communications. And, I've gotten to attend a couple of meetings while being here, and it's very interesting. And we just don't get anything like that in school. And also, how labeling, the process of creating a label, how a monograph becomes a monograph. That's really important in our field. And we learn how to read one, but we know nothing about how one is created. So I just wanted to give you guys a little insight about what pharmacy students are exposed to before, you meet a student and, maybe expect them to know more or less about a certain subject. So yeah, there's a lot that we do not know about the ongoings within the FDA. So I've enjoyed my rotation here. And does anyone have any questions?